Hi there, I'm Lillian. Welcome to my channel. Here I help Christian wives heal their femininity so they can stop thinking like sons of God and start embodying their lives like His daughters. I talk about my own journey and how healing my feminine heart led me to the discovery that I was married to a type 3 man. That's the type of man that's a Nabal. If you don't know if you're married to a type 1, 2, or a 3 husband, you can find a link for that in the description box. Do you want to learn how to understand God's Word as a woman, heal yourself by His sanctification, and possibly transform your marriage by faith and knowledge? Then this is the place for you. Keep watching. Today I want to talk about what the experience feels like in marriage when you're being neglected. Let's start with a foundational truth. God chose to use man as the source for a woman, instead of creating her from the dirt like He did with the man. His intention is clear when we look at the relational dynamic between men and women. When God created the man first and then took the woman out of the man's body, He was sending a powerful message about the responsibility of masculinity. This idea is reinforced through a few references in Scripture. Genesis 2, verses 21 through 23, shows that the woman was created from man. This establishes the man as the source. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7, it's stated clearly that masculinity is responsible for femininity because of its strength. And it's not just marriage and relationships. This creation order sets the stage for the practice in the Jewish culture where the firstborn male bears the responsibility. These patterns indicate a deep link between being the source, being first, and bearing responsibility. If a woman was taken out of man, making him the source, then masculinity inherently carries the responsibility for femininity. And if that wasn't enough of a foundational truth, there's more. In Ephesians 5, God tells a husband to love his wife like he loves his own body, that he's got the responsibility of taking care of her, just like Christ takes the responsibility for the church. By aligning the husband with Christ, God's intention is shown in the outcome. Jesus came to earth to be the source for His church. Jesus is the source and the strength, just like the husband is the source and the strength for the wife. God's demonstrating His intention for a man towards a woman when it comes to marriage. The husband is responsible for the whole woman, not just part of her. And that means he's responsible for her heart and soul, which is where all of her femininity lives. Neglect in marriage can come from two different factors. First, it depends on you. Where are you in your healing journey? And second, it depends on the kind of man you're married to. If your husband isn't taking care of his own physical and emotional and spiritual health, he likely won't take care of you and your feminine heart either. When you're being neglected, it leads to feeling lonely and frustrated, which usually ends up in a lot of conflict, especially if you're unhealed and operating in masculine energy. Embracing your feminine design and healing can help restore the balance that God intended in a one-flesh relationship. And that's if you're married to a husband who is a type 1 or a type 2. But if you're married to a type 3 man, he's the Nabal, the man who's evil and dangerous to you. Your healed femininity will draw out a completely different response than it would from a husband who is a type 1 or a type 2. If you don't know what kind of man you're married to, you can watch my video that describes the 3 different kinds of men in marriage. I've put a link in the description box. If you feel neglected, it could be your greatest indicator that you need to do the inner work to heal your heart. God uses unhappiness and dissatisfaction and even emotional pain to get our attention. Healing your femininity will affect your marriage in powerful and positive ways. Unless you're married to a Nabal, that's going to have a different powerful effect on the marriage, but it won't be a positive one. Another thing to remember is that these signs of neglect aren't something you generally see before marriage. They emerge, if they're present, they emerge after some time has passed in the marriage. So How can you recognize neglect in your marriage? Let's get started. The first sign of neglect is that there's lots of conflicts and fights. You find yourself almost caught in arguments over the smallest things. It feels like every minor disagreement descends into a major conflict. You end up feeling confused and frustrated a lot. And you're never able to put your finger on why it keeps happening. Your husband could be using these interactions to vent his frustrations and resentment towards you because you want something in the relationship that he doesn't want to give you. You want to experience attention and consistent care so that your femininity feels cherished and emotionally supported from his masculinity. I was married to a Nabal. That meant he never picked fights directly. Instead, he would say something that was just a little off, or it leaned towards mean, or he would do something covert to hurt me. And then when I would bring it up, because everyone tells you to communicate, right? So whenever I would try and talk to him about it, that's when the fight would start. When you expect a mature conversation and you take great effort to be kind and measure every word and phrase, yet you're met with more resistance and dismissal instead of acceptance or understanding or any options for resolution. That's not normal conflict. It's strategy. It's like you're trying really hard to follow the best marriage practices for communication from Billy Graham's wife. But what you're dealing with at home is Walter White. Part of the solution is to recognize that the words conflict and fights in this context don't mean the same as they do in a healthy relationship. If you can recognize this pattern, it doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you an emotionally intelligent daughter of God who's got great powers of discernment. When your husband turns normal communication into another fight, and you've tried your very best again, Romans 12:18 says it's time to lean back away from him and refuse to engage. In Titus 3:10, God says, warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time, and after that have nothing to do with them. That's a little harder to do in marriage, but it is possible. And in Proverbs 20, he says, it's to one's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel. Remember the one from Proverbs 20. That's going to factor in at the end of the video. The second sign of being neglected in marriage is when all the effort is one-sided. Does your husband initiate relationship contact and make plans, or is it always you? A neglectful husband rarely goes out of his way to spend time with you. And this is a sign he doesn't value the relationship in the same way that you do. So there's an unspoken expectation that it's going to be you who keeps the relationship alive. What he's done is transfer the heaviest part of the relationship. That's the headship part, the initiation part, the guidance part, and the decision-making part. He's done this so that he can lean back, so that you'll make him the receiver of the work, and you can be the one responsible for doing all the work. Even though God placed all of that responsibility on him, he's reordering it so that the majority of it is on you. And now you're starting to feel the weight of it. What you're experiencing is the feeling of neglect. He's not just a weak or a passive kind of negligent planner. He is breadcrumbing you. The truth is that without you, the two of you would never talk, and the relationship would slowly diminish into non-existence. And the thought of that reality, a wife hides deep down because it's a realization that's just too scary to accept, and it makes you feel kind of nauseous. I've done a series on breadcrumbing. I'll link it in the description box too. Knowing that you can depend on your husband's masculinity and that he's committed to the marriage isn't just an option for your feminine heart. Without his contribution to your heart, it won't be able to sense any security and trust. And security and trust are the two relational components that are necessary for femininity to be a part of the one flesh dynamic. Unless you receive these two components, you will continue to feel neglected. You need to ease off your efforts by leaning back. This will allow your husband many opportunities to take responsibility for maintaining the relationship. If he doesn't, it's a clear sign that he's not invested. Stop initiating and focus on you. Focus on your spiritual life, your own interests and hobbies, and start looking to intentionally invest in relationships with people who reciprocate the efforts it takes to maintain friendships. Number 3 is that there's an emotional barrier. In a healthy marriage, there's openness and vulnerability. But when you're being neglected, it feels like there's a wall built around your husband's mind and heart that shuts you out. While you're living unfiltered and truthful, it's not being reciprocated. There might have been open sharing and exchange in the beginning, which added to the special feelings that you had. But despite all of your sharing, it feels less and less like shared exchanges or experiences. Something has changed and it doesn't feel even between you. When I look back over the patterns that I had experienced, what happened is that the more I shared, the less he knew about me, it seemed. I could see this over the years by the gifts he bought me. Whenever I received a gift from him, it wasn't quite me. The longer we were married, the more unlike me they were. Even though I shared easily, it was super confusing. The other thing that kept happening was that the more I tried to learn about him, I was accused of trying to control him, or that I was somehow prying into his life. The chasm between all that your husband knows about you and what he's actually paid attention to shows how much you're being neglected. All his interest in the beginning was a fact-finding mission to hide the truth that there's no real or genuine interest. When the communication and openness doesn't happen on both sides, it's a sign of emotional withholding. The solution is to stop oversharing and start observing. Only communicate your feelings when it's necessary, and when you do, make sure they're stated clearly and simply. Then make sure to create emotional space for yourself and protect it. Proverbs 25, verse 28. The fourth sign of neglect is a superficial connection. Does your time together feel uneasy or even forced, like your husband is just going through the motions? More like he's putting in time with you to get onto something else. It feels like there's an awkward, subtle tension that feels unsettled. That's a sign of disingenuous behavior. In a healthy relationship, authenticity and honesty should reduce tension over time, not increase awkwardness. If there wasn't any in the beginning stages of your relationship, and now, after marriage, tension is not just present, but it's always kind of brewing in the background whenever you're together, and you feel it more often. It's an indication of lack of genuine connection. In a relationship with a neglectful husband, a wife lacks the attention and presence that communicates to her that she's seen and heard. Quality time and undivided attention are essential to the experience of feeling like you're receiving contribution in a relationship. But neglect leaves you feeling insignificant and invisible. When you're not a priority, a gap is created that slowly fills up with loneliness and emotional discomfort. This gap highlights the contrast between neglect and the attention you feel from genuine presence. Focus on authenticity and honesty in your interactions. Look for activities that fill that gap, activities that make you feel alive and true to yourself. If he's unwilling to be genuine, you have to accept the truth that there's a lack of depth in your relationship and reconsider that you might need a different approach to your marriage. Number 5 is a tough one. In fact, in my experience, it's probably the hardest one. It's when your husband is stingy or tight-fisted with resources. It's when he's financially possessive. The strength of a healthy marriage is that there's interdependence. You lend each other resources and you share your possessions. Think of Acts 2, verse 44, when God says that all believers were together and held all things in common. He's talking about how a community of believers operate with each other. Marriage between two believers is a primary community, embodying the same spirit of unity and a shared purpose to increase the kingdom. Husbands who demonstrate selfishness with any of their resources are profoundly neglectful. You can especially see this one when it comes to the largest resource that we have, which is money. So, around money and finances and budgeting, there's a lot of tension and fights. With neglect, you see that all things are not held in common for the community of the two of you. He might say you have all things in common and that you share, but that's not the reality you experience in your marriage. His words and the relationship dynamic are at odds with each other. When your husband controls the resources, instead of experiencing mutual respect that fosters worth and dignity, you feel a massive sense of insecurity and a lack of respect because of the power imbalance. My sister, it's so important to establish clear boundaries, to make sure that resources are shared fairly and that all of the financial decisions are made together. Not some, all of them. If you haven't set boundaries in this area, take some time to explore why you haven't. It's crucial for the health of your heart and soul and for the well-being of the wine-flesh relationship. Focus on shifting your mindset about the financial dynamics in your marriage. Understand that your inherent worth is beyond the value of financial contributions. It's essential for you that your opinions and feelings about finances are respected and considered. Lean into God for courage and guidance so that you can establish your needs with dignity and self-respect. Number 6 is that there's an aimless drift. If there's neglect, there's going to be physical and emotional distance. You'll feel like there's less time together, and it's a struggle to communicate well or at all. And making plans is difficult and complicated, even kind of uncomfortable. It seems like a subconscious drift in the marriage, but it's not. It's a pattern of behavior to intentionally create distance between the two of you. He stays married to you for practical purposes in title alone. He only engages in the relationship when it's convenient for him or when he wants something from you. I know this is an ugly thing to hear, and I'm sorry because I know how much it hurts. You experience unreliable support. He's not there when you need him. This looks like breaking commitments and being absent during critical moments in your life. I don't mean he's guessing that these moments aren't critical or that you haven't told him that they are important. He knows it. Another way it manifests that kind of goes along the same lines is disregard. That looks like him making decisions for the two of you without care or thoughtfulness. There's a disregard for your feelings and needs. You find out about it afterwards, after the decision has been made. This creates worry inside of you. You worry about his commitment to you, and you feel undervalued and uncertain about the relationship. Without consistent reliability, it's impossible for your femininity to feel cherished, and that ends up deepening the sense of neglect and emotional distance. This means your marriage will lack consistency and reliability, which are essential if you're going to create a healthy one-flesh relationship. When he's emotionally absent, you feel inconsistency from his presence. What I'm talking about is a vibe or energy. Us women, we can feel when someone is in the room with us, but they're checked out. Your husband can be sitting on the couch right beside you, and you can feel it. It's that tangible. When he's letting the relationship drift, your femininity can sense that. There's an absence of masculine provision. You feel disconnected, isolated, unsupported, and unprotected. Lonely, but not alone. I felt like I was married to a single person. The mistake I made for so many years was thinking that it was my responsibility to step in and take care of that drift in the marriage. What I was sensing was true. There was drift, but I had the wrong solution. God wasn't showing me so that I would do the job of masculinity for the man. He was showing me so that I would take the opportunity to learn to take responsibility for the well-being and health of my own feminine emotions and feelings. If your husband's not willing to bridge the gap in the relationship, let him drift. Just because he's not going to prioritize you, that doesn't mean you don't. This is an opportunity for you to develop stewardship of your own femininity, all that you are because of who God created you to be. Focus on restructuring your life in a way that fulfills you, independent of the failure of his masculinity. Number 7 is emotional distance. All friendships take work, including the one-flesh relationship, which actually takes the most amount of work over all the other relationships. When there's neglect in this relationship, you feel it intensely. In the beginning of the relationship, your husband was probably attentive. If he wasn't, you probably wouldn't have married him. If a woman sees neglect in her future, she's not going to sign up for marrying into that. But after marriage is when it gets exposed. You start to experience neglect by him pulling away. This makes you feel clingy and deprived for trying to maintain the friendship with him that you thought you had. And then it gets worse. If you don't honor this neglectful treatment by submitting to it, you'll hear pejorative phrases like you're clingy or needy or too sensitive or overly demanding. Or maybe he doesn't say those words straight out, but in his interactions with you, you get the message and you feel like you're asking for way too much. You're not wrong for expecting emotional availability in marriage. It's normal for femininity to need masculinity to be emotionally present and responsive with her. And that's one of the ways that he's the source. It's his responsibility to provide a safe space for the expression of feelings and emotions. If you think about the whole marriage, from the start of the relationship until now, what was he like in the beginning of the friendship? And as it turned into exclusive relationship and then to marriage, are there contrasts? How is it different? If the dynamics have changed or subtly shifted, it's important to recognize and understand that. Number 8 is that there's a lot of friction in your marriage. If your husband loses his temper often or seems stressed or irritated, if he used to be occasionally frustrated, but now it's becoming more frequent and the direction of his frustration has shifted from things outside the marriage to being things closer to home, or worse, it's directed more at you. This change in your marriage dynamic highlights that what you thought was a passionate or an enthusiastic person might not be passionate at all. The neglect has become evident because it's contrasting with the extreme tension. There's a correlation between the two because they're opposites. The only attention you now receive is during moments of tension and pressure. Otherwise, you're neglected. In the beginning of the marriage, this tension you experienced was sporadic, but now both of those feelings have become so intense that you can feel the oscillation between them. This is what's exposing the underlying truth of your relationship. The love and affection you thought your marriage was moving towards have pretty much disappeared. The regular expression of love through words and actions and physical touch never actually fully developed. What you expected to grow into a nurturing and affectionate relationship has instead withered, leaving you feeling abandoned and isolated. I saved number 9 for the last because it's the biggest one. You need for this to be not present. If there's any hope to reconcile through the other 8, it's the one that stops you from the very start. Number 9 is communication barriers. Has your husband ever left you feeling like you're talking to a brick wall? If your conversations feel limited or forced, it's a sign that something's off. Neglectful husbands give away as little information as possible. They won't share their genuine thoughts or feelings, and they don't ask questions to deepen their connection with you. Instead, they provide short, simple answers that leave you wondering where to take the conversation next. If you ask, "How are you doing?" an authentic friend in a real relationship would share what's going on with them, and they would ask about you in return. But a neglectful husband replies with something short and blunt. Even though he's pretending to be kind, the conversation still ends up stopped in its tracks, or diverted, or somehow stalled out. A good husband may not know how to engage in deeper conversations because no one has taught him about the importance of understanding and appreciating femininity. And if you're unhealed and you struggle to take care of yourself, he won't be able to see the example he needs to follow because you're not setting that for him. Men learn about relationships through the woman in their life, not just with words. They learn more by the example you set. If you're not taking care of your femininity, he can't learn how his masculinity is supposed to be supporting and providing for you. On the other hand, if you're married to enable, he stops conversations for completely different reasons. His responses are generic, impersonal, and they lack intimacy. He deliberately withholds information about himself for 2 reasons. First, it's because he thinks that the one who has the most information is the one with all the power. So the more he knows about you and the less you know about him, he's positioned better for strategy. The second reason is to intentionally withhold his masculinity so that your femininity can't receive from his provision. He knows masculinity is supposed to provide for femininity. A man who's a poor communicator is a very different kind of man than the one that's intentionally withholding. What kind of friendship can you have with someone who deliberately doesn't talk? You can't. All you can do is imitate what you think a relationship would look like with this man. A friendship is the foundation of a relationship. And when you get married, that relationship becomes the deepest and closest form of a relationship that there is. It becomes a one-flesh union. Without that friendship foundation, or if the friendship has deteriorated, it's not emotionally healthy to pretend it still exists. Those are the 9 signs of being neglected in marriage. I'm sure there's others. Let me know in the comments if you know of any that I've missed. To wrap up, I want to say that being able to sense that you're experiencing neglect in marriage is an important step towards healing and embodying your feminine heart and reclaiming your emotional strength. I've got 3 reasons why it's important to recognize neglect and 2 advantages that are not just going to allow your femininity to honor God, but they're the most beneficial to you and the marriage. By recognizing neglect, it helps you to identify where you've been doing his job for him. When you stop doing his job, you stop taking the responsibility of building and maintaining and directing the relationship. As the head, it's your husband's God-given responsibility to do headship things for the body. In keeping with the body metaphor that God gave us, eyes do eye things, legs do leg things. Eyes can't do leg things. By you leaning back, he gets the choice to step into his masculine ability or to show the real nature of the kind of relationship he wants. Can you pinpoint areas in your relationship where you felt burdened by the responsibilities that should be your husband's? Next, you'll be able to stop initiating. God didn't create the body to be driving the relationship. The body is the responder to the head. He intentionally gave his daughters less testosterone and more estrogen so that we wouldn't be the ones constantly initiating interactions. He never meant for us to be the ones doing all the effort required to maintain the connection to the head. The body doesn't cleave to the head. It's the man that cleaves. If you're the only one trying, it's time to pause and let the head show honor to God through his commitment to you and the marriage. How do you think your relationship would change if you allowed your husband to initiate so that you could position yourself as the receiver and the responder? The third one is that you'll have the freedom to stop blaming yourself for the state of the marriage. Neglect is a form of abuse, defined biblically as sinning by omission. James 4:17 says that if you don't do what you know is right, you have sinned. It's not your fault that the marriage is struggling. It's not your fault that the man you married won't exercise his masculinity. The weight of that responsibility belongs on the man who decided to have a wife. Have you found yourself blaming yourself for the struggles in your marriage? How can acknowledging neglect as a form of sin by omission change your perspective? Now for the advantages. The first advantage to seeing that you're being neglected is that it makes it easier to figure out how to respond as the wife when you know your femininity isn't receiving proper headship from masculinity. Everything becomes clear to see. Not easy to do, but clear. The truth always makes things clear. Jesus says the truth sets you free. He doesn't say it'll be easy or painless. Know that you can still go through all the motions of routine and duties and functions that are required to take care of your family and run the home, even while being neglected in the part of the marriage that's the one flesh relationship. This doesn't mean you accept the neglect of your femininity. What it does mean is that you understand that the stewardship of your identity and worth as God's daughter is not dependent on the actions of your husband. The second advantage to identifying the truth about your relationship is that it allows you to live authentically with God, making him the priority. It frees you from the facade that there's a one flesh relationship that's vibrant and growing underneath the functions of marriage. Living transparently in the truth about your femininity brings you into a place of honesty with yourself and spiritual growth. Neglect is the most insidious form of relationship harm because it's hidden and private. When a husband neglects his wife, he refuses to fulfill his primary masculine responsibility of providing emotional support and care to the feminine creature that he promised he would. He actively erodes the trust, safety, and security that femininity would receive from him as her source. Instead of receiving consistent attention, care, affection, communication, and openness, a wife is left feeling isolated and unloved. This constitutes a serious breach of the marriage vows. God stands behind his daughters in marriage. Well, he stands for all of his daughters. But when it comes to marriage, he makes a serious declaration to any husband who doesn't take the one flesh relationship seriously. In 1 Peter 3:7, God tells every husband to live with your wife in an understanding way, as with a weaker partner, showing her honor as your co-heir of the grace of life. Then he increases the intensity of the command by adding a consequence. I will cut you off if you don't honor me in this. I paraphrased that last part. If you're married to a type 2 husband, the neglect will organically begin to disappear, or you will be able to begin having conversations about your feelings and emotions. Not overnight, but as you stop doing the responsibility of headship, he will step into it. Healthy masculinity, even though it might be banged up and messed up and in need of some healing, just like you, he can't not take responsibility for femininity. But with a type 3 man, he has chosen to use the power of his testosterone for evil. So it won't get better. Well, it will at first, but only as long as it takes him to figure out a different strategy. The type 3 man is the kind of man who is like Nabal. According to Abigail, her husband was a worthless fool who lived up to his name. He will not just return back to the way he was. Your marriage will get increasingly and intensely worse until he eventually leaves. Or he begins to physically hurt you. Be careful of that. I was married to Dean for 32 years, and it was in the last 2 years when I started getting stronger that his actions became physically aggressive. Don't pretend there's a relationship when your husband has only cultivated neglect. It's fine if a man is a poor communicator, but he doesn't get to receive the results without the work. Just like God says, if anyone is not willing to work, neither should he eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. It's deceptive and disingenuous for a husband to think he's going to enjoy any of the fruit from a one-flesh relationship without putting in the work of emotional provision and care in love. To honor God's spiritual truths about a one-flesh relationship, a man must sow his masculinity into it. If he refuses, there will be no femininity for him to reap. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6, and Hosea 10, verse 12. Thank you for listening until the end. It means so much to me. If you have found value in my content, please click the subscribe and like buttons. The best way to spread this message is to engage with it, so the algorithm pushes the content. I need your help to do that. My goal is to help more sisters embrace their unique femininity. So if you know of a sister who might find value in what I've shared, please share it with her. I want as many wives as possible to hear this message so they can recognize and understand if they're being neglected in their marriages. Bye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.